Hi everyone, this tutorial is on how I made my speakers removable for transit. I started again by making a pattern and I just measured out how long I wanted it to be in comparison to my board and just tried out some shapes out of cardboard. Once I had the size and shape that I liked, I turned it into a paper pattern so I could draw out all the details that she has on her speaker. I cut out my pattern out of 2 cm isolation foam and then used my paper pattern to cut out all the details that she has on her board. I used the same pattern to cut out the pieces that had to be more 3D and layered where I needed to have it layered. Next I cut out a bunch of strips so I could glue them around the sides. I used hot glue to glue down the first layer and the first layer of all those edges. It doesn't have to be perfect at this time. Next I measure out where on my board my speaker will end so I can mark out the placements of the PVC pipe. I use a bunch of pieces of scrap cardboard to figure out how I wanted to shape the outside box around it. I just took little pieces, put them in the place where I wanted it to be, marked where I had to cut some parts off, tried this out, and if it fit I would stick it down with painter's tape and just keep altering the shape and keep adding little pieces until I had the shape that I wanted. This was all trial and error, but I ended up with a pretty solid pattern. Once I had all the pieces into a pattern, I transferred it onto more cardboard and cut this out. I scored all the lines that had to be folded because it gave a prettier seam than it would if I had to cut them all separately. But you don't have to do it, and it was a lot more work. Then I used painter's tape and hot glue to glue everything in place. More hot glue and more hot glue. I used the same technique of using some spare cardboard, putting it on the place that it had to go, draw on where it should end, and just cut it out to close the entire back. Then I mark where I want my speakers to be and cut out a space for it in my top layer of foam. Transfer the marking to the first layer so I can cut out more space there. Once I peeled out the foam, I used a pencil to poke a hole through the entire speaker so I can connect it with the wires for my actual speaker so I can have some sound. Next I measure how deep I can put my PVC pipe through the speaker and just mark this on a pipe. Then I cut all the pieces out so I can put this in these connector pieces. I had a little bit too tight of a fit, so I just used my Dremel tool to make the connector piece a little bit wider. Then I pushed the PVC into the back of my speaker so I can have a space to glue in the PVC pipe. I put the speaker against the board so I can mark out where the connector piece is going to go inside of my board. Then I just cut out some of the foam to make space for it. So the connector piece goes inside of the board, the piece of PVC goes inside of my speaker, and then I can just slide them into each other. Next I took more of this packaging foam that I also used for the top of my board and I just painted in the colors that I wanted mine to be, making sure to mix some colors to get a nice transit. I just had it pinned in place. Next I take some aluminum foil and I fill the hole where my LEDs are going to be so I can have the lights reflected and hopefully be a bit more bright. I just glued it in place with hot glue. Next I mark out a space where I'm gonna cut out more foam so I can put my battery pack in there. And then I'm gonna measure out how much LEDs I have to cover this entire board. And at this point I was so sick of soldering that I was just gonna fold it in there. So this is pretty much the lazy version. Then I just hot glue all the LEDs in place. I had to cut out some of the foam between the different holes so I can pull the string through there without having to cut the LEDs and solder them back. Next I laminate more laminating sheets so I can cover my foam with it and protect it. I glue the packaging foam in place and then cut out the foam that is in front of my battery pack. and in front of the hole of the speaker. Then I glue the laminating sheets in their spots, and for the big part I just tape them together so I can glue them really close to each other and you hardly see the seam anyway. Then I cover all my last details with some 2mm craft foam. I use contact glue because it gives the nicest seams, and then I just hot glued them onto the speakers. I turned on the light so it was easier to see the placement. I had to alter my pattern a bit because I ended up altering the shape of my speaker a bit, but then I used this pattern to cut out a shell for the outside. This again is made out of the 2cm isolation foam. I cut all of this out and then bevel the edges to have a nice smooth look. I keep my box cutter at about a 45-degree angle and just cut small pieces of foam. I covered all my foam in packaging tape just to make it a bit sturdier and make it easier to glue. And then I just glue it in place. I glued down some magnets for that one detail piece that has my actual speaker in it, so I can remove it and I can remove my batteries. I just glue down one part of the magnets, and once my glue is cooled down, I put down the other magnet, put some glue on top of it, and just press the detail part on top of it. That way the magnets will be in the right spot. Next, I covered the back of the speaker with more plastic and tape so I can make a pattern for my craft foam. I tried to have as little seams as possible, but it's a pretty difficult shape to cover. Then I used more contact glue and some super glue just to glue all the edges of my craft foam in place. I cut out more strips to cover the inside. Next, I heat seal all the craft foam with my heat gun and then use some silicone caulking to close up any seams. Make sure you use caulking that you can paint over, and I just wet my finger a bit with some soapy water to smooth it all out. I covered everything in 2 layers of black acrylic paint and then used some painter's tape to mark out where my silver stripe was gonna be, and then just paint that silver. For me, it took about 3 layers. Then carefully removed the painter's tape and it is painted. I ended up putting 2 layers of varnish over it just to protect my paint job, and then it was done. You can just slide it in with the PVC pipes. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, you can subscribe to my channel. You can see more pictures of this costume on my Facebook and Instagram, and stay tuned for the last tutorial on my board, which will be on soldering the LEDs for the rest of the board.